Welcome to Global Risk Community Chat. Today our guest is Michelle Hilscher. I'm very happy to have you here today, Michelle. Welcome.
Thanks very much. I'm really excited to be here.
Likewise. So before we get into the topic, can you briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. So I am a behavioral scientist and I work at BEworks, which is a management consulting firm. We are Toronto based and we work with a lot of different clients to solve behavioral challenges.
Yeah, that sounds really fun actually in a way. So with that being said, what topic would you like to share with us today? I imagine something about behavioral science.
You bet. Yeah, absolutely. I thought it would be great to just talk about behavioral economics and what it can tell us about risk.
Yeah, sounds good. So let's then jump right into it and maybe then start with sharing some key things about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing for everybody to know is a little bit about what is behavioral economics and what does behavioral science tell us about human behavior. And I think the first thing to keep in mind is that it tells us that we are often very short on time. We're often very short on, the energy that we would need to consider all information that might be in front of us, including when we're encountering uncertainty or risks in our lives. And what that means is that we rely on something called heuristics. Those are mental shortcuts. That's how we make decisions a lot of the times. And what that means for risk specifically is that when we are thinking about what's going on in the world and perceiving if something's good or bad, risky or not, that judgment is actually driven by heuristics. A nice example here might be, when people are trying to judge the likelihood of an event, what they actually do is they use the shortcut of, well, what would the consequences be of this event? Would they be severe or maybe not? Maybe they would be minor. And it's the severity that people think an event would be that is their shortcut to determine how likely that event is going to be. So for instance, how likely your life might be lost when skydiving versus getting a nosebleed when skydiving. A bit of a, macabre example, but what we know is that people inflate the loss of life, the odds of that happening, because of its sheer catastrophic nature, even though, the nosebleed would be something that would be more likely, but it's underestimated because it's comparatively minor.
Yeah.
Now, another thing, if you want me to keep going, or maybe you've got another question.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so another thing that we know from research on risk psychology is that it's domain specific. So that means that you can have somebody who is going to, take wild gambles at the casino, but they'll be the ones perhaps who are paying for extra travel insurance to cover their trip to that very casino, or who, maybe they would go to extreme lengths to avoid any sort of social conflicts where they would risk, having that relationship be eroded. So what we want to keep in mind is that if you're trying to figure out whether someone's a risk taker or whether someone's risk averse, you cannot look into other domains in their life to determine whether that's likely or not. So for instance, if you're thinking about the financial domain, you can't look at other areas of their lifestyle as a proxy for what they're likely to do when something happens, like markets, being volatile.
Yeah.
So maybe the last thing I can share is that, these shortcuts are also what determine the behaviors, in fact, that we will do when we encounter risk. So we often, are not going to do what we think we will or say we will. And there are predictable irrationalities that show up when we're responding to risks. So for one thing, when we are sure that a loss is coming to us, those are moments when we will predictably take risk to try and avoid those sure losses. So that's where you'll see investors selling during market volatility, for instance. And when people feel like a gain is sure, it's very likely that they're going to get something, that's where they become very risk averse. So they don't want to take any risks that would perhaps make that unlikely. So that's a nice example would be that we would settle for $20. Sure bet we'll have it, rather than putting into our names into the hat for maybe the possibility of winning like $100. That is something we are not going to do. We'll be risk averse.
Yeah, sounds good. And I hear a lot of examples, of course. So I want to kind of make a follow-up on that, and that would be do you have maybe like a case study example from BEworks or anything from, like that you have experienced that could share something unique or unexpected about risk?
Absolutely. So we do a lot of work across sectors where risk behaviors are going to show up, whether that is in the financial domain or health related, even in this area of sustainability. There are definitely risk related challenges. So one I can share with you is a challenge we tackled for a Canadian bank. They had gone through a lot of trouble to help improve the communications that they give to customers whose credit cards have been hacked into and are being used by fraudsters. And so you'd think this is a situation where when a customer knows that their card is being used by a fraudster, that they would do everything in their power to help themselves. What the bank learned is that despite the fact that that risk is salient, there's a different risk that is even more salient to customers, which means they don't help themselves. And that is the very channel by which the bank is reaching out to the customer. It was through an SMS. So they're getting a notification on their phone and they're feeling like, oh my gosh, the notification on my phone is unfamiliar. I don't expect my bank to connect with me through my phone. I would expect a phone call. And therefore, my goodness, maybe this itself is a fraudster trying to get me. So there's one risk that is overriding their reaction to a different risk that would be more salient and more extreme. So definitely a very counterintuitive example. And what we did there is we built a new type of message that would be sent to customers that would offer them the certainty they need about what the steps are in resolving this situation. And we combined channels so that they would get an email at the same time as a notification on their phones, knowing that we can piggyback on their comfort level with that email channel because they're used of that channel being a way of communicating with the bank. So that's how we overcame that risk challenge.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. I actually really makes sense with the banks. I mean, personally, I also just get like 2-3 different channels of communication. So yeah, it's interesting to hear it from that angle as well. So with that being said, I want to jump into our last question, and that would be, what would be some takeaway points you could share with our audience?
Absolutely. So I think one of the most important things as a behavioral scientist that I can tell folks who are listening would be the importance of running experiments, because even though there are predictable irrationalities that show up in our behavior, they are still context dependent. And, the example that I gave related to the SMS messaging, we only learned that by running an experiment where we compared customer behavior when customers received an SMS with a particular kind of message in it to what the bank had originally been doing. So testing through experimentation is the way of validating whether a strategy is going to work or not, and can tell you what amount of behavioral impact is actually going to, come about by a particular approach or intervention that you introduce.
Yeah, thank you so much. And with that being said, we are unfortunately out of our time. So once again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. And I think the topic was super interesting and also a bit diverse and what our risk managers or audience are used to hearing. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, that's basically it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me. It was nice to be able to speak to you.
Likewise. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too.